has abandoned her responsibilities, Your Honor. She has been absent, irresponsible, and completely unfit to receive anything from this estate. My brother didn't even pause when he said it. He was looking at the judge, but I knew every word was aimed at me. He straightened his tie, glanced back at the row of relatives he'd convinced to show up, and sat down like he'd just done everyone a favor. I didn't react. I didn't shift in my seat. I looked down at the table and checked the time on my phone. 9:47 a.m. 4 minutes. That was how long he'd been speaking, and he had no idea that every word out of his mouth was being used against him. Have you ever sat in a room while someone who knows you, someone who grew up in the same house, ate at the same table, called you family, looked a judge in the eye and lied about you? Not exaggerated, not misremembered. Lied. Deliberately, carefully, with a rehearsed expression of concern. Drop a yes in the comments if you know what that feels like. I want to know how many of us have sat through that silence and survived it. My brother's name is Dominic. He's 41 years old, owns a landscaping company in Barrie, Ontario, and has spent the better part of the last 3 years convincing our extended family that I am the problem, the flaky one. The one who moved to Vancouver and forgot where she came from. The one who showed up late to our grandfather's funeral, which, for the record, I did not. But that story has been told so many times now that half our relatives believe it. I am 32. I work in financial compliance. I am very, very good at documenting things. Our grandfather passed away 18 months ago. He left behind a modest house in Sudbury, a savings account with the Royal Bank, a small TFSA, and a handwritten will that left everything split equally between Dominic and me. That was it. There was no drama in the will. The drama came after. Dominic was named executor. I didn't fight it. I was in Vancouver, he was close by. It made practical sense. I trusted him because he was my brother, and because I was grieving, and because sometimes you let your guard down at exactly the wrong moment. The first red flag was small. He told me the estate was worth about $180,000 once everything was accounted for. My share would be around $90,000 after probate fees. I didn't question it. I sent him my banking information. I waited. 6 months passed. He told me there were complications with the property. Environmental assessments. A lien on the house he hadn't known about. Legal costs piling up. He sent me a spreadsheet. It looked professional. I almost believed it. But here is the thing about working in financial compliance. You develop a habit of reading documents the way a doctor reads an X-ray. You don't just see what's there. You see the shape of what's missing. The spreadsheet had columns, figures, dates. It also had, if you looked carefully, a series of disbursements to a numbered company. Ontario Corporation, registered 18 months ago. Right around the time our grandfather died, I looked up that company. It took me about 20 minutes on the Ontario Business Registry. The registered agent was a name I didn't recognize. But the mailing address was Dominic's landscaping office on Dunlop Street in Barrie. I didn't call him. I didn't confront him. I opened a new folder on my desktop and I started building a file. That was 8 months ago. The court hearing was Dominic's idea, which tells you something about how confident he was. He had filed a notice of objection to the estate distribution, claiming I had received an informal advance from our grandfather years ago, a loan he called it, of approximately $40,000, that should be deducted from my share. He had a document. He claimed it proved the loan. He claimed I had signed it. He had also, in the weeks leading up to the hearing, made calls to our aunt in Timmins, our 2 cousins in Ottawa, and our mother's old friend who still lived in Sudbury. He told all of them that I had been difficult throughout the entire process, that I had threatened him, that I wasn't well. They were all sitting in the back of the courtroom when the hearing started. I had arrived early. I sat at the respondent's table and I placed 2 folders in front of me, one blue, one gray. I did not open either of them. Dominic finished his opening statement. His lawyer. I'll call him the lawyer because his name doesn't matter. His lawyer was a thin man who kept clicking and unclicking his pen. He had the energy of someone who had been told the case was straightforward and was starting to have doubts. The judge was a woman in her late 50s. Judge Hennessy. She had a way of listening that made you feel like she was not just hearing your words, but cataloging them. Miss Avery, she said, looking at me over the rims of her glasses. Your brother has made some significant claims regarding the estate and your conduct during the administration process. Do you wish to respond? Dominic leaned slightly forward. He wanted the defensive answer. He wanted me rattled. He had seen me rattled before, At family dinners, at Christmas, during the one time we had a genuine fight about our grandfather's care in his last year. He knew what I looked like when I was angry, and he was waiting to show the judge that version of me. I looked at him directly. I kept my face still. Not cold, not hostile. Just still. Settled. Like a surface with nothing moving underneath, even though underneath I had been preparing for this moment for 8 months. I appreciate the court's time, I said. I'd like to let my brother finish presenting his case. I want the full picture on record before I respond. The lawyer stopped clicking his pen. Dominic blinked once. He turned to the lawyer. Something passed between them that I couldn't quite read, but that felt like the first crack in a wall. They proceeded. The loan document came out during the second half of Dominic's presentation. His lawyer approached the bench with it, a single page, a notarized agreement dated 7 years prior, stating that my grandfather had lent me $40,000 to help with the down payment on my first apartment in Vancouver. There was a signature at the bottom that looked like mine. The gallery murmured. My aunt shifted in her seat. I heard one of my cousins whisper something. And here is the thing about forged signatures. If you sign your name the same way for 30 years, any forgery will have one problem. It will look too much like you. Too clean. No one signs a document the way they sign their name when they are practicing it. Real signatures have interruptions. Tiny hesitations. The pen lifts in places you don't consciously decide. I had sent that document to a forensic document examiner in Toronto 3 months earlier. I had the report in the gray folder. But I didn't reach for it yet. Judge Hennessy, Dominic's lawyer, said, the evidence clearly shows that the respondent received a significant financial benefit from the deceased during his lifetime. Under Ontario succession law, this constitutes an advancement on her inheritance and must be taken into account when calculating her entitlement from the estate. Dominic looked at me again. This time the expression was different. This time it was the look of a man who had already spent the money in his head. Let me tell you what Dominic didn't know. He didn't know that 6 weeks after I found the numbered company, I had contacted a lawyer in Toronto who specializes in estate litigation. He didn't know that I had submitted a formal request through that lawyer for the complete financial records of the estate, bank statements, property appraisal, all disbursements, under the Estates Act. He didn't usually send voice my voice that, when not the $180,000 he had told me about, but closer to $340,000. The house had been appraised at $225,000. The RBC account and TFSA combined had held just over $115,000 at the time of death. He had told me the estate was worth $180,000. The actual figure was nearly double. He also didn't know that I had tracked every transfer out of the estate account over the prior 14 months. $42,000 to that numbered company in 5 separate transactions. $17,000 in administrative fees to an account that traced back to the same address as his landscaping business, and one transfer of $28,000, described in the records as property maintenance costs, made 3 days before he filed the notice of objection against me. The total diverted was just under $90,000. He had taken my half. He had taken it carefully and slowly and with what I think he believed was untraceable precision. And then, when I hadn't noticed, or when he assumed I hadn't noticed, he had gotten greedy. He filed the complaint about the loan to take more. He didn't understand that I had been watching the whole time. He didn't understand that I hadn't called him out immediately for the same reason a careful person doesn't pull the fire alarm before the investigation is complete. I needed the full picture. I needed a pattern, not just a moment. In financial fraud, a single transfer can be a mistake. $42,000 across 5 transactions, routed through a company that didn't exist before the estate was opened, is a pattern. He thought my silence was absence. He thought I was distracted, busy with my life in Vancouver, too far away to pay attention. He had no idea that silence is sometimes a document in progress. Miss Avery, Judge Hennessy said, her voice even. This loan agreement does carry a notarized seal. Do you have anything to say about its authenticity? The room went quiet. My aunt had stopped shifting. My cousins had stopped whispering. Even the lawyer had stopped clicking his pen. I reached for the gray folder. I appreciate the question, I said. I don't have a denial. I have a report. I walked to the bench and placed the forensic document examiner's report in front of Judge Hennessy. I didn't hurry. I moved like someone who has already read the last page of the book and is simply walking someone else through the earlier chapters. This is an analysis by a certified forensic document examiner based in Toronto, I said. The report examines the signature on that loan agreement and compares it with 12 authenticated samples of my signature collected from legal documents, tax filings, and lease agreements spanning the past 9 years. The conclusion is on page 3. Judge Hennessy turned to page 3. The conclusion was that the signature on the loan document had characteristics consistent with deliberate copying rather than natural execution. Specifically, the pressure distribution was uniform in a way that is not typical of an original signature produced under normal conditions. The examiner had found what she described in the report as evidence of slow drawing. Slow drawing. That is the technical term for what happens when someone copies a signature carefully, trying to make it look right. Real signatures are fast. Muscle memory. Fakes are slow. Dominic's lawyer stood up. He's objecting, saying the report is unilateral, not court-ordered. That's a fair objection, I said, before Judge Hennessy could respond. Which is why I've also requested, through my counsel, that the court order an independent examination. I'm happy for a second opinion. I have nothing to hide from a second opinion. Dominic looked at his lawyer. The lawyer looked at his legal pad. I returned to my seat. But here is where it became something else entirely. Because Dominic, when he is frightened, does not go quiet. He escalates. I have known this about him since we were children. When he is losing, he reaches for something bigger. He reached into the file folder in front of him, and he pulled out a second document. This one he handed directly to the bailiff without passing it through his lawyer first. The bailiff brought it to the judge. This is a letter, Dominic said, his voice finding steadiness again. A letter written by my grandfather 14 months before he died. In it, he expresses serious concerns about my sister's financial judgment. He describes an incident in which she borrowed money from him and refused to discuss repayment. He says, and I quote, that he worries she will take advantage of this situation when he is gone. I heard my aunt make a small sound behind me. Judge Hennessy read the letter. She was quiet for a moment. Then she looked at me. This does appear to be in your grandfather's handwriting, she said. Are you familiar with this letter? I am, I said. The room shifted. I felt it. My cousins exchanged a look. Dominic's expression moved into something that was almost relief. I let him have it for exactly one breath. Then I opened the blue folder. That letter, I said, was written during a period when my grandfather was experiencing significant cognitive changes. He was diagnosed with early-stage vascular dementia 14 months before he passed. I have a letter from his physician at Health Sciences North in Sudbury confirming the diagnosis and the approximate onset. The letter you are holding was written during the period his doctor describes as one of increasing confusion and susceptibility to influence. I paused. I also have, I continued, a series of text messages between my brother and my grandfather from the same period, obtained legally from my grandfather's phone, which was in my possession following his death because he gave it to me when he could no longer remember the passcode. In those messages, my brother repeatedly asks my grandfather to write down his concerns about me. He frames them as, and these are Dominic's words, just getting things on record, Grandpa, just in case. I placed the printed transcripts on the bench. He coached him, I said. My grandfather was confused and frightened and lonely, and my brother used that window to plant a narrative that would be useful later. In court. Here. The gallery had gone completely silent. Dominic stood up. That is a lie. Dominic, Judge Hennessy said, and the single word was enough. He sat down. I remained standing. Your Honor, I said, I also want to address the estate accounting directly, because the loan document and the letter are only part of what I found. I had submitted, through my counsel 2 weeks prior, a full forensic accounting request. The results were in the blue folder. I walked Judge Hennessy through them, not dramatically, not quickly, carefully, the way you walk someone through a compliance audit when you need every number to land. The estate was worth $338,000. Dominic had reported $180,000 to me. The difference, $158,000, had moved through the estate account in a series of transactions over 14 months. $42,000 to the numbered company, $17,000 in false administrative fees, $28,000 in fabricated maintenance costs, the rest in smaller amounts that individually looked like normal estate expenses, but collectively formed a pattern that my forensic accountant described as consistent with systematic misappropriation. Every transfer was documented. Every destination account was traced. Under the Criminal Code of Canada, I said, this meets the threshold for fraud over $5,000. Several of the transfers also cross provincial lines, which engages additional federal considerations. I have already provided this documentation to the Ontario Provincial Police Financial Crimes Unit. I did that last Thursday. Dominic's lawyer put down his pen. Not clicking it, just put it down flat on the legal pad. I looked at my brother. He had come here today to take the rest of what I was owed. He had a forged signature, a coach letter from a man with dementia, and a courtroom full of relatives he had spent months preparing to see me fail. He had been so certain of the outcome that he had dressed for a victory. I noticed the suit when I came in. He doesn't usually wear suits. I felt no satisfaction in that moment. I want to be honest about that. Standing there, looking at him, I felt something quieter than satisfaction. It was closer to the feeling of finishing a very long piece of work. The kind where you have been so careful for so long that the ending feels less like a triumph and more like a release of breath you didn't realize you'd been holding. I have one more thing, I said. I reached into my bag and placed a third document on the table. Not for the judge. For my brother. This is a formal notice from the Ontario Estate Trustee replacement application I filed 2 weeks ago, I told him. I've applied to have you removed as executor and replaced by a court-appointed administrator. Given the evidence of misappropriation, I'm advised the application will be granted within 30 days. Dominic stared at the paper. Once that happens, the estate will be reopened, revalued, and distributed according to what the records actually show, which means your share will be recalculated after restitution is deducted. He opened his mouth. I also want you to know, I said, that the numbered company you used, I flagged it with the CRA. They have questions about whether the disbursements to it were reported as income. That's between you and them now. He closed his mouth. Behind me, I heard my aunt say something to my cousin in a low voice. I didn't turn around. Dominic looked at his lawyer. His lawyer was already packing his legal pad into his briefcase, not rushing, just quietly, efficiently, closing the file. Your Honor, Dominic's lawyer said, standing, we may need to request an adjournment to review the new materials. Judge Hennessy looked at him for a moment. I'm going to need more than a request for adjournment, she said. I'm going to need a full response to the accounting discrepancies the respondent has raised. She looked at Dominic. And I want to be clear, Mr. Dominic, that this court takes the allegation of document fraud and estate misappropriation very seriously. You will have the opportunity to respond, but I want you to understand the weight of what has been presented today. She set down her pen. We are adjourned until October 14th. The room began to move. Chairs scraping, bags being picked up, the low sound of people recalibrating what they thought they knew. I stayed seated for a moment. I stacked my folders. I put my pen in my bag. I did not look at the gallery. My aunt touched my shoulder as she passed. She didn't say anything, but she stopped, briefly, and she touched my shoulder, and I think that was the closest she could come, in that moment, to admitting that she had believed the wrong story for a long time. Outside, it was a cool morning, that particular September light that you only get in Ontario, low and golden, coming in sideways. I sat on a bench outside the courthouse and I called my lawyer. She had already heard from Dominic's counsel. The adjournment was going to be a formality. The accounting evidence was too thorough, too documented, too complete to be argued around. 3 weeks later, Dominic withdrew his objection. The executor replacement was granted. A court-appointed administrator took over. The estate was revalued. The misappropriated funds were ordered repaid as a condition of avoiding criminal prosecution. Dominic cooperated, the OPP was satisfied, the restitution agreement was structured over 2 years. The forged loan document was referred to the Crown Attorney's office, though I was told not to expect a fast timeline on that. My share of the estate came to just over $169,000 after legitimate costs. Not a fortune. But it was my grandfather's. He worked 40 years at the Inco mine in Sudbury, saved carefully, bought a modest house, and wanted his grandchildren to have something after he was gone. That was the whole of it. That was what Dominic had been willing to destroy. I transferred the money into a registered account and I made one purchase with part of it. A framed photograph from a trip my grandfather and I took when I was 12. Just the two of us. Up to Killarney Provincial Park. He's standing at the edge of the water, squinting into the sun, smiling at whoever is taking the picture, which was me. He always said that was one of his favorite weekends. I put it on the wall in my apartment in Vancouver. And every time I see it, I think about what he actually was, and not what my brother tried to make him into. At the end, when he was frightened and confused and couldn't protect himself. You don't always get to choose when someone tests your patience. You don't always get to choose when the moment comes that requires you to be still and quiet and extraordinarily careful over a very long period of time. But if you can hold it together, if you can keep building the file when everything in you wants to make the call and end it, sometimes the truth doesn't just come out, it comes out with receipts. And that is the only kind of coming out that sticks. There is a photograph on my wall right now. My grandfather is standing at the edge of the water at Killarney, squinting into the sun, and he is smiling because I am the one holding the camera. I was 12. He had packed egg salad sandwiches and a thermos of tea, and we had driven up from Sudbury on a Friday morning without telling anyone where we were going. Just the two of us. He said that was the best kind of trip. I think about that weekend a lot when I think about what Dominic tried to do. Not because it makes me angrier. It doesn't, not anymore, but because it reminds me what was actually at stake. It was never really about the money. It was about whether my grandfather's life and what he wanted for us would be honored or erased. What I learned from all of it is hard to say in a clean sentence. It's not one thing. It's three things, braided together, and I don't think any one of them works without the other two. The first is that integrity is not passive. I used to think of honesty as something you had when you weren't lying. But sitting across from Dominic in that courtroom, I understood something different. Integrity is also what you do when no one is watching, when you could easily let something slide, when calling it out would cost you time and energy and peace. Every month I built that file, I made a choice. I chose to document instead of dismiss. To be precise instead of emotional. Dominic assumed I would eventually give up and accept whatever number he gave me. The fact that I stayed honest about what I was actually seeing, was the first thing that protected me. The second is that clear thinking is a form of self-defense. When I found the numbered company, I felt the pull to call him immediately, to confront, to demand, to react. But I knew that one transaction is not a case, pattern is a case. So I waited and I kept thinking clearly, and every month that I didn't react, the evidence got stronger. I'm not naturally a patient person. I had to choose that clarity over and over again. It felt some days like holding a door shut against wind. But the thinking saved me. It saved what my grandfather left us. The third is the one that surprised me most. The capacity to absorb difficulty without breaking. There were months in that process where I genuinely didn't know if I had enough. Enough documentation, enough money for legal fees, enough emotional reserve to keep going. My grandfather had spent 40 years underground at the Inkel mine, and he never once described that as sacrifice. He described it as what you do. I used to think that was a generational thing, a way of not complaining. Now I think it was actually a form of wisdom. You keep going not because you're certain of the outcome, but because you believe the thing you're doing is worth the cost of doing it. Dominic made his choices too, and they are catching up with him in ways I didn't engineer and didn't need to. That's not karma in any mystical sense. It's simply the weight of consequence. When you build a life on deception, when you coach a confused old man to write things that aren't true, when you file a forged document in a court of law, you are making a structure that cannot hold. Eventually, the math stops working. I bought that print and framed it and hung it up on the first day the money cleared. Not as a trophy. As a reminder that the whole point was him and that weekend and the egg salad sandwiches and the way he smiled when he didn't have to be anyone's patriarch or patriarch. Just a man standing at the edge of a lake, happy to be there. That is what I was protecting. And it was worth every bit of it.